Joshua Basseches is the David and Jane Flowerree Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Environmental Studies at Tulane University. His research examines the politics of energy and climate policymaking at the state level. Joshua, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Great. Glad to be here.
So to start, I'd love to ask you, what does climate policymaking at the state level look like?
Climate change is obviously one of the biggest challenges of our generation, of our lifetime. And in the United States, the history has been such that it's really been the state governments that have taken the lead in trying to address climate change through public policy. The one exception after decades of pretty much only having action at the state level was during the Biden administration when they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is currently the Congress is attempting to repeal it. So with that exceptional little blip on the radar, ironically, given the global nature of climate change, it's been the state governments, not the US federal government, that has been sort of in the driver's seat. Um, and that looks different in different states because every state is different politically, economically, and there's lots of different policy tools that have been used to address climate change and specifically the different economic sectors that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So you've got the electricity sector, and you've got the transportation sector, and you've got the buildings, the heating and cooling of buildings. And you've got industry like manufacturing of all kinds of different products. And all of these produce greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to policy change. And all of these are areas that different states have taken different approaches to trying to mitigate. Yeah, so.
So what states have had the most progress on climate policy and why?
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting question because the states that have done the most in terms of climate policy are not always the states that have, created the most renewable energy or even reduced emissions the most because of how complicated, it is to try to eliminate carbon, which is literally in everything. It's in everything we do. It's part of the production process of things we use and things like that. So the states that have, but of course, because it's a global issue, anything that a state does is helpful, but never enough. And there's other factors too besides state policy, like for example, how easy it is to permit new projects that can also indirectly affect climate change. And so the states that have politically had leadership have been California, as well as the other West Coast states like Washington and Oregon, as well as the states in the Northeast. But recently, there's been some progress made by states in the Midwest, like Illinois and Michigan, for example. And some states, like Texas, even though they have not been intentional about trying to reduce climate change, have, because of their other policies related to infrastructure and permitting, managed to cite more wind and solar than any of these other, more Democrat capital D states that have been working on climate change. So, it varies, but I would say the states that have been doing the most are the states that have been controlled by the Democratic Party, just because it's been an issue, even though it should be an issue for everybody because it affects everybody. It's been an issue that the Democrats have taken the lead on. And so those states that have had the longest track record of working on this issue have been the West Coast states and the Northeast states. But like I said, recently there's been some exciting activity in the Midwest as well. I should also mention Minnesota in addition to Illinois and Michigan.
So what is the role of large investor-owned utilities in this work?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that because this is really sort of the angle that I focus my research on. So investor-owned electric utilities are basically the companies that we pay our electricity bills to. And they serve about 75% of US businesses and residences that consume electricity. And the rest are served by publicly owned utilities or rural cooperative utilities. And they are really so important in terms of decarbonization and in terms of what we're able to do on climate. And part of that is because they are monopolies. So even though they're for-profit companies, like where I live in New Orleans, it's Entergy is the name of the utility. But you could just look on your electricity bill, no matter where you live. Like in Virginia, I know it's Dominion. I don't know where specifically you are, but if you look at your utility bill, and so these are monopolies, but because they're monopolies and because they're private companies, also, they are heavily regulated by the state governments and by the federal government, but mostly by the state government. And, the quality of the regulation varies, but because of this, the state government has more tools in their toolbox to be able to encourage these utilities, to move in different directions with regard to sustainable energy, for example, because they're monopolies, therefore, because the state has so much more regulatory influence over them than other types of private sector companies, they have like really a lot of ability to affect them. But also, these companies have so much stake and so much involvement in electricity, which of course is then the strategy for decarbonizing other sectors. So in addition to just electricity and how much of the electricity comes from, clean energy like wind, solar, hydro, even nuclear versus fossil fuel energy like gas or coal, that's one thing that the electric utilities are all over because that's their actual business. But then also, if we want to reduce the carbon footprint of other sectors like transportation through electric vehicles or heating and cooling of buildings through the installation of electric heat pumps instead of gas furnaces, and all kinds of other things, we are going to need a lot more electricity. And so that's their business. The investor-owned utilities are in the business of supplying electricity, regardless of where that electricity comes from. And electricity is what we're going to need much more of if we are ever going to replace other fossil fuels that we use for energy production to fuel our society. So that's why they have such an important role.
So why do some power companies support climate policies, but others don't?
Yeah, so that is a function of a lot of different things that make that industry extremely diverse, even though they share in common that they're monopolies and that they're heavily regulated and that they make money in a different way than other businesses, which is by building infrastructure, which we could get into if we have time. But the reason that they vary a lot has to do with the fact that in different parts of the country, the structure of the electricity market looks different. So in some parts of the country, these utilities own the entire electricity system, which includes generation assets like coal plants, gas plants, nuclear plants, wind, solar, transmission assets, which are the big power lines that you see in going, in across the country, and distribution, which are the smaller power lines that bring the electricity to your actual home or business. So in some parts of the country, like the Southeast and the West, the same company owns all of that. But in other parts of the country, they've restructured, and the generation business is actually a competitive business that has many different companies besides just the investor-owned utility. And the investor-owned utility is sort of the middleman that buys the wholesale power from the generators and then sells it to the end-use customers and really only controls a part of the system. And so depending on this, they have completely different incentives in terms of what kinds of energy portfolios they want to have. But the other reason that they're different is because they are so heavily regulated by the state, it means that the state politics affect them a lot more than they might some other companies. And so with states becoming more divided in terms of red states and blue states, In all states, regardless of whether they're red or blue, the utility has an incentive to get along well with those in power in the state. And so getting along well with politicians in blue states looks very different than getting along well with politicians in red states. And so the utilities adapt their strategy. And so as a result, while they're always interested in making money for their shareholders, which is something that some people find problematic, how they do that as a function of both economic factors and political factors varies a lot from one state to another.
So, what are some of the most effective strategies related to advancing climate policy at the state level?
Yeah, so I think because of this, it's really important for those who are interested in advancing climate policy to first of all realize that they should be paying a lot more attention to what's going on in their state houses, in their states. And this is very difficult because the media does not do a great job. I mean, there's 50 different states, so it's a lot harder to cover what's going on in all of the states than it is to cover what's going on in just one place, meaning Washington, D.C. And so the first thing is to get oriented into like, who is your state representative? Who is your state senator? You know, what kinds of legislation have they been introducing? And to get involved with groups that are working at the state level, like just to name a few, Evergreen Action or NRDC or lots of other different groups that are active at the state level to sort of plug into how they're trying to advance their agenda for clean energy and for sustainability. And specifically, in addition to familiarizing yourself with who your state elected officials are and what issues they're pushing, the other thing is that there's these, and this relates to the investor-owned utilities, that there's these specific commissions in every state called public utility commissions or public service commissions, or I think in Virginia it's called the Corporation Commission or the state commission. I forget. They have somewhat different names, but in every state, their job is to regulate those public utilities. And depending on the state, they're either appointed by the governor, the commissioners that serve on those commissions, or they're elected officials. And regardless of whether they're appointed or elected, it's also good to get to know who they are and to figure out how you can influence and support for the ones that are already advocating for cleaner energy, how you can support them or influence them if they're not. And I'll just mention there's a new organization called Power Lines that was just set up. Their website is powerlines.org. And they're really trying to do something which I think is so important, which is basically building awareness of these commissions and helping people get more involved. And sometimes that includes, frankly, like applying for jobs in these commissions because they rely on a lot of staff in order to effectively regulate these massive companies. And a lot of people who are interested in sustainable energy or climate change, they wouldn't necessarily think that working in a state commission called a Public Utility Commission would necessarily be the best way to advance those priorities. But especially now with what's going on in Washington, it actually really is the best way. And so those are just a few ways that people can get more involved.
So, how can or what can individuals and communities advocate for to their power companies and state level policymakers? What should their advocacy include?
Well, I don't like to tell people what to advocate for, but I'll tell you what I think is important, which is one thing is to continue to support what's called an all of the above strategy for energy, which is actually, interestingly, it used to be that, you know, the fossil fuel industry and the opponents of climate policy were the ones advocating an all of the above strategy because they didn't like these new technologies like wind and solar that were threatening to take over the market, and they wanted to include gas and coal, so they wanted all of the above. But now what's happened is the economy has changed, and some of these renewable technologies are actually the cheapest technologies. And every technology has its pros and cons in terms of affordability, cost, reliability, right? Because obviously there's not the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So it's true that other technologies besides wind and solar are better for reliability, but wind especially is often better for cost. And then there's also other factors. So now in all of the above approach, now that the economy has evolved and renewable energy is less expensive than ever before, it's actually in the best interest of the climate to support an all of the above approach, which means that when you absolutely have to burn fossil fuels to keep the lights on, you're doing that, but you're not also creating barriers to these other forms of technology, which include not just wind and solar, but also hydroelectricity and geothermal and all this other cool technology that allows us to produce electricity without increasing our carbon emissions. So that's one thing I advocate for is to make sure that there isn't backsliding due to culture wars for affordable technologies like wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, nuclear. That state policymakers are ensuring that the playing field remains level for all of those. And then the other thing that they can advocate for, which is more affordable electricity, which again used to be in conflict because it used to be like when wind and solar were first introduced, they were more expensive. And so by pushing those, by mandating those, there were impacts on affordability of electricity. But now we're in a situation where the questions about affordability have less to do with which technology you're using and more to do with how much of your electricity bill is going to the shareholders of these investor-owned utilities and how much is really going to for them to operate to bring you the power. So now there's the cost, like now, the system costs in general should be coming down, and it's a question of who pays and who benefits with between investor-owned utilities, ratepayers, which are normal electricity customers, which can include commercial ratepayers, residential ratepayers, industrial ratepayers, and also these data centers. And so it's all about so what people can advocate is for the cost of the system to be allocated fairly and specifically for regulators to keep the profit margins thinner for these companies so that they can deliver those savings to people who are struggling to keep their lights on due to, in some ways, the cost of electricity, as long as we allow all of these new big data centers to come onto the grid, in some ways, increases in the electricity costs are inevitable just because we're demanding more power. So we're going to have to build more things. But the question is, how much can we keep those cost increases under control, or do we allow them to get out of control? So that's another thing people can advocate for.
So what do you think the future of this work looks like, specifically at the state level of working to advance climate policies? What do you think, or maybe what are some potential futures?
Yeah, so for one thing is for right now, given that the federal government we have now, for whatever reason that I think I truly don't understand, just seems to be ideologically opposed to clean energy. In this period, that just means that the work is even more important at the state level. And in terms of how people can get involved, like I said, working for state governments, and that includes both on the political side, electing state officials who care about climate change and clean energy and who are going to advocate for it, as well as working in some of the more technical or bureaucratic roles that are associated with the clean energy transition, as well as coming up with new policy ideas that can tackle the climate crisis in more creative ways than we've thought about before. And that can start with education, like pursuing graduate studies in energy or environment, but it could also start with private innovation and investing in startup companies that are coming up with new solutions. And so there's all kinds of ways to advance the clean energy and transition, even despite the unfriendly people that seem to be running things now in Washington, D.C. But it can look in a lot of different ways. And so the key thing is picking one sector to sort of focus on or one area to plug into because the problem is so massive and climate change is such a serious problem and it's so diffuse. The causes are there's so many causes and contributing factors that if you try to take everything on at once, it'll be very frustrating. So sector specific solutions. And in the electricity space, that can include coming up with new ways to regulate the utilities, new ways to what's called performance-based rate making and new ways to incentivize the utilities. But it can also include, like I said, new technologies and also thinking about like how public transportation, housing, all of these issues intersect with climate. And so, all of them are important and all of them have opportunities for progress at the state level.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for sharing your insight and your wisdom, and I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
Yeah, great. Thanks for doing this, and I hope people learn a lot on your channel.